Hi there, welcome to Boxing Deep Dive. I'm Lyndon Hosking, and this is Dream Fights. This is where we match up fighters from the past and present, great fighters, and break it down and see who we think would win. So I'll welcome in our hosts or co-hosts for tonight, Peter Matiatis and Mike Altamura. How are we, guys?
Great to be on the show, Lyndon. Good to see you, Mike.
Well, it's up to me tonight, and I think I've got a really good one. Before we get into that, I want to go over last week's poll, and that was Jeff Fennick versus Barry McGuigan. 100% for our man, the Marrickville Mauler, Jeff Fennick over Barry McGuigan. No love whatsoever, Mike. So next time, I want you to have a real good think about who you're going to get on. I'm taking Tassie's sort of spot here, and letting you know, mate, we've got to lift your game for the next show.
Think we need more Irish viewers. Maybe that will change.
Yeah.
On paper, it was a great fight, but unfortunately, the fact it was an Aussie involved, not, as I said, not much love for Barry McGuigan. But we get on to this week's fight, and as I said, it's going to be a ripper. It is the dream fight between Larry Holmes and George Foreman, and this is prime Larry Holmes and prime George Foreman. And when I say prime, I'm probably thinking 81, 82, 83 for Holmes and sort of 73 to 74 or 75 for George Foreman. So, interesting one, this one, Pete. They just almost got to fight each other a couple of times. Actually, it just never really come off.
No, it didn't. What a fight that would have been as well. Holmes's left hand and movement up against the bombs of George Foreman. It just would have been one of those classic fights because both guys belonged and competed at that top level for a very long time. So the amount, I don't know if it would have been a blockbuster pay-per-view buys because both of them, Holmes wasn't as a massive, even though he's such a great fighter, didn't have that crossover. And Foreman with his grills and stuff and that health stuff, he's crossing over at the later part of his life, but early on he was the villain that fought Muhammad Ali and stuff like that. It just would have been an interesting fight, and that it would have it could have gone a lot of ways.
Mike, it's easy to imagine the modern day Foreman and the modern day Holmes to probably newer boxing fans, but back to the prime Holmes and prime Foreman before he retired the first time, it just would have been a mouth-watering fight, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I'll cover the modern day version first. So they were scheduled January 23rd, 1999, Houston Astrodome. Foreman had a guarantee of 10 million. Holmes had a guarantee of 4 million. There was clauses in Foreman's agreement in which two payments needed to be made, one 4 weeks out and one 3 weeks out from the contest. So I believe it was, he received the first million, Holmes received his first 400,000. With Foreman, the next 6 million was due, and then the final 3 million was due the week following. The promoter, Roger Levitt, never made those payments. The bout was rescheduled then for March. However, like a lot of these fights that are floated and then don't attract much interest at the box office, it fell by the wayside. I'm one of the few that's grateful for it. I think that had we seen them, Foreman would have been just turned 50. Holmes would have been 49 years of age. Foreman never fought again. His last fight was with Shannon Briggs in 97. Holmes fought 3 more times. But even by the 1990s version, they were so post-prime of that I don't think it would have done either of their legacies justice. Now, when you talk about the prime versions, you've got the brute force and brutality of Foreman, and you've got the skill, the jab, the slipperiness of Larry Holmes, the relaxation, the fact that Foreman, other than Gregorio Peralta, in which he scored a TKO 10, the only time he really went rounds was twice. He got stopped by Ali in 8 rounds, and he lost to Jimmy Young over 12, and knocked down in the last round due to exhaustion. So we know where the danger is. The danger for Holmes is in the first 5 rounds of the fight. He had been clipped. He got knocked down heavy by Ronaldo Snipes, got knocked down heavy by Ernie Shavers, stopped post-prime by Tyson in 88. So we know where the danger for Holmes was, which was the first 5 rounds. The danger for Foreman, if he doesn't clip him early, Holmes may outlast him. So great contrast the styles, and I think it would have been a really fun fight.
No, agreed. Well, let's have a look at Larry Holmes, the Eastern Assassin. Finished up with a career of 69-6 with 44 KOs. Won the WBC heavyweight title. Never lost it in the ring. Was taken off him. He then took up the IBF heavyweight belt. 19 title defences between the two of them, and you can see they're inducted into the 2008 International Hall of Fame. So, just back in the day, Pete, that jab of Larry Holmes, it was just probably the greatest of all time.
Plus the movement, he had great movement, and I mean, Holmes was getting groomed by Muhammad Ali. He was Muhammad Ali's chief sparring partner, and I mean, he used to go to town on Ali sparring. He was one of these gym champions as well, so it was always, doomed for greatness. But Holmes was just one of these guys as a promoter. You found it hard to promote. He didn't have that colourful thing. Some fighters are easy to promote, some aren't. Holmes was because he was pear-shaped. He had the jab and everything. He didn't have something that was lacking. I don't know what it is, because he just didn't get that mass. Riddick Bowe was probably the same. They just didn't cross over to make that. And it's not their fault. It's just some fans love some fighters, some fans don't. But he grew up, as we mentioned, I mean, with Muhammad Ali in training camps. You can't get any more better education than that. And George Foreman, I mean, the guy was probably one of the heaviest-handed fighters. There's Ernie Shavers as well. But, he was one of those guys that could knock you out at any time and knock you out cold. So it would have been a very, very, very interesting fight. The movement of Holmes and the skill. And Foreman wasn't bad. I mean, Foreman used to throw bombs. But he also could, he could put his punches together. He wasn't clumsy. So it would have been interesting as far as where the fight would have gone early, because if Foreman could have landed some big shots early, you just don't know, because Holmes a few times used to get staggered, but he was one of those fighters, if he got hurt, he'd recover quick. I remember with Tim Witherspoon, he was hurt, and then all of a sudden he's clinched on a Witherspoon. They did like a waltz for a bit.
Ninth round, yeah.
And he sort of cleared his head quick. It was like, now he's boxing better and safer than he was before. I mean, he can come back from a big hit, and that's the thing I respect about Larry Holmes. He was one of the best fighters at holding and clinching when he was hurt. So that might have had to come in effect up against George Foreman, because there's no doubt Foreman would have clocked him early.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it, Mike? Larry Holmes, he had the heart of a lion, but most of the time he was actually more dangerous when he was hurt, wasn't he? Because when he was hurt, he'd bite down on that mouth guard and he just let him go.
Well, you got right here, with Ken Norton, that was 7 rounds apiece after 14, and Holmes had to bite down and go and pull it out in the 15th round, which he did. And I think that reflected a lot of what you said, what drove him. The irony with Larry, when he turned pro, there was 2 question marks on him. One was his heart and the other one was his chin. And both proved to be exceptionally great, especially his heart. Like he was a guy that a lot of people slept on. But I think that his greatest trait, which is why he also found success in his comeback, was his trait to be relaxed, which is why he could box 15 rounds sleeping on his head, because he was so relaxed. He wasn't your kind of guy that was going to run a 3-minute mile, but he was sure going to give you a good 3 rounds times 15 every fight.
And Pete, you said before about his personality, and for one reason or not, he just wasn't quite accepted. It was probably the post-Ali era, but he did try, didn't he? He tried to talk it up, and he tried to wear the fur jackets and stuff, but it just never really fit his psyche, did it? It just never really fit his image.
Yeah, it's funny that, and it's not the fighter's fault. Some fighters are just colourful that you absorb to, like Arturo Gatti. Technically, he wasn't the best fighter that ever lived, but he's just so loved. Even kids now that never saw him fight that talk about Arturo Gatti can see how much love they got for him. It's just he's got that charisma. And Holmes, he didn't have that fighting charisma, but he was such a hell of a fighter. And that's not his fault. I mean, it's Julian Jackson's the same. I mean, he just didn't have that charisma. It was going to be a crossover fighter. But that's why promoters are promoters. You've got to come up with gimmicks to try and get them to cross over and build up the numbers, because promoter pays them that money. They have to protect themselves with bums on seats. So, but the fighter, as we said, he has to then, live up to it and try and sell some seats as well, with whether it's trash talk and whatever it takes. But with Holmes, I think he just was one of these guys at the end, people just couldn't take a liking to. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and Mike, we spoke about it in the classic fights with Barry Michael. He was just one of those guys that just he craved respect, he demanded respect, but he just struggled to get it, didn't he?
He fought most of his career in Ali's shadow,
And he was bitter about
and
it
I
too.
think that led. Yeah, well, that led to him having a chip on his shoulder, and he felt like he didn't get the respect. He wasn't that charismatic African American champion. He felt like he was, whether it was Marvis Fraser, whether it was Jerry Cooney, whoever it was, he always felt like he was being pitted against the guy that was supposed to beat him and carry the torch of the sport.
Yeah, well, especially against Cooney, when they introduced Holmes first, even though he was the challenger. He was the champion. Probably
Yeah.
never been done before. Probably never get done again. Where they introduced a champion before the challenger. But yeah, he did really. As I said before, like about the respect. He really was bitter about it, wasn't he? And it was always. And I think Pete, that was probably epitomised when he lost to Michael Spinks, and he said at the press conference that Rocky Marciano couldn't carry his jock strap, and it was really that bit pretty hard into him, and he had no respect. He was probably never going to get it after that.
Yeah, look, it was just frustration. But Larry Holmes became a successful businessman. He owns a town. Lives in. I think he's worth 100 million. So he's won in other areas. He's just, I mean, he'd have a great story to tell with being in so many training camps with Muhammad Ali and that fight with Muhammad Ali as well. So I mean, this guy's one of the legends of the sport.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
And 19 title defences. I mean, he was such a hard to beat fighter. Even though you wanted him to get beat, as we mentioned, there was guys, White Hope, Jerry Cooney, these guys who were coming to beat him. He just used to win, and that's what a true champion does. So, and beating the Butterbean when he was 51 or 52, that just put the icing on the cake, because the Butterbean was getting away with that many, set up fights, and Butterbean's a great guy and everything, but it was just good to see that Larry wasn't going to take the script and go down. Larry boxed him and beat him as an old man. So put things into perspective, because back then a lot of people were saying, would the Butterbean beat Tyson over 4 rounds and stuff like that. I'm just non-boxing people, and it was good to see an old man come in and just school him, and it just puts things into perspective. So Holmes won a lot of respect for me doing that over the Butterbean.
All right, well, let's have a look at his opponent. Big Bad George Foreman, 76-5, 68 KOs. World heavyweight champion in 1973 when he beat Joe Fraser. And then, look at that, 21 years later, he wins the WBA and IBF heavyweight titles from Michael Moorer. Oldest boxer to ever win the heavyweight title at 45. And 2003 International Hall of Fame inductee. And Mike, it's easy to think of the modern day George Foreman, but back in the day, this guy was a bit like the Sonny Liston back in his day. He was an absolute monster, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, he completely reinvented himself. He was the jovial grandpa, very relaxed style, whereas in his younger days, he was a ferocious puncher. And he always carried that punching power even in his later years, but he was winning bouts more on ring craft. Whereas here, like Pete said earlier, he actually put together combinations a lot crisper and smoother than people thought, because every shot he's throwing is thunderous with knockout intentions, but his balance was better than people think. A lot of people take the fight with Ali and they don't look at that as a one-off, but, like he was fairly well balanced, whipped his shots from all angles, good uppercut, good hook, could punch both sides, and was relentless. Just a savage knockout artist.
He reminded me, Peter, a bit of a cross of Clubber Lang and Ivan Drago, wasn't he? He's just this massive big guy who just let him go from the fence. And you look at these fights here, they just wind him up and just let him go. There's no signs there whatsoever. Obviously, later in his career, he used a bit of his ring experience to set punches up. But here, there was no setting it up. It was just stick the left hand out and let the right hand go and the left hand afterwards.
Yeah, but look, 6'3" back then was unheard. That's when we start to see the big heavyweights come, and he was such a big figure and such a power puncher and explosive. And the second coming of his career was probably where we got to see George Foreman, the person. He became a preacher.
Yeah.
He was doing stuff for charity. The first part of his career, he probably wanted just to be like a badass guy. He kept to himself. He didn't have many people around him that he trusted. And then we saw the human being side come out, and it's just such an amazing career. We saw the first part And it was like two George Foremans existed. It was like a different person a second part because everyone was so loving and caring towards him. And we know, Mike Tyson's people, even when he made his comeback as an old man or in his 40s, they didn't want to have anything to do with him. Technically, it would have been a horrible fight for Mike Tyson.
Yeah. But Mike, he had this ability, didn't he, of durable fighters like Joe Fraser, Ken Norton, these types of guys, just to absolutely iron them out. Where others like Ali had struggled against these guys, and he'd just take them out. Oh, hang on, we've lost Mike. I'm sure he'll be back. What do you reckon, Pete? Look at these punches against Joe Fraser, and at the time, it was an absolute shock because Fraser had obviously beaten Ali, and I think it was either 3 or 4 to 1 underdog to beat Fraser.
Yeah, and you see these punches, every single one of them is loaded. Like there's nothing. He's just swinging as hard as he can, and they're chopping. I mean, they would do a stack of, they're just big windmill chopping punches. And we mentioned before, he was one of the first giants to come in with that type of speed as well. His speed was pretty good.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he wasn't slow. His speed was pretty good. So what he did to Fraser, no one could believe. And he was just taking guys out that were normally durable. And he was just this hulking figure. It was like the Incredible Hulk. And
he was just one of those guys. I'll bring Mike back in here. We'll just bring him in. There he is. He's back. Are we all good there, Mike?
Yeah, battery died.
Oh, all right. Oh, okay. Don't you hate that? All you YouTubers out there, make sure your phones are charged, okay? But we're just saying, Mike, that the guys like Joe Fraser and Ken Norton, and the list goes on, these guys that were very, very durable against very good fighters, and George Foreman would just go in there and literally almost club them to death.
Yeah, well, and there was a number of guys like that were known for their resilience, and he obliterated them. Even guys like George Chuvalo, he pulverized Chuvalo into submission. Stopping Peralta, it took him 10 rounds, but Peralta was extremely resilient. Nobody was stopping him at that time. Tough Argentinian strongman, and Foreman gave him a beatdown for 10 rounds. But it really was those two fights. The one firstly started with Frazier, and then with Norton. I mean, they were the two that people just thought, who can actually stop this force? I mean, heavyweight boxing really, probably since Sonny Liston, hadn't seen a puncher of his nature. But just like Pete was saying, 6'3" back then was enormous. He was really the first of the real true, strong, physical, at least somewhat coordinated heavyweights. And in that sense, he was probably a little bit ahead of his time. Like you said, he's a little bit crude in how he put his punches together, but they were still fluid enough.
Yeah, and it's almost a bit of a shame, Pete, that Larry Holmes wasn't born even 5 years earlier. He would have been a mix with Ali and Fraser, and he fought Norton later on, of course. But back in those prime times, because it could have been, talk about the Kings. Unfortunately, Larry never had any of those fighters to dance with, and then of course later came the Tyson era and Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe and these types of guys, and he missed out on that era as well. So he was almost in forgotten land there, wasn't he?
In between, man, but 19 title defences, we saw that, and he's always hard to beat. And he did what he had to do to win fights, and it was just to pick these two guys together. It's a real hard one. I've been thinking about it a lot because this fight could go a number of ways. It just could go a number of ways.
Well, we'll get to the tips in just a sec, but Mike, just one last thing. One thing I've always respected for Holmes is that in those 19 defences, there was no real soft targets in there. They were all, he just literally cleaned out every single heavyweight contender of his time.
Well, again, I know that pre-Tyson, the heavyweight division becomes somewhat fragmented, but you look at, he beat Witherspoon, and it was a young Witherspoon, but he beat Witherspoon, he beat Weaver, he beat Bone Crusher Smith. They're all future world champions. They won world titles that, Holmes would have had the unified title, but because of politics, he vacated. But they all went on to success. So you've got to give credit where credit's due. Even, way post-prime, was it in 92? Holmes outpointing the Olympic gold medalist in Ray Mercer against the odds, then pushing Evander Holyfield 12 hard rounds. You have to respect that.
No, you do, and that's the one thing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of fighters they get judged a little bit harsh. And I think we've done it a few times on these episodes where we've done our rankings and that sort of stuff. And sometimes fighters are the victim of their own sort of error, I suppose. And it looked like Larry was obviously one of them, but the fact that I don't think you can think of anyone in his era that he didn't fight. That's the sign of obviously a great champion. It was a shame that he never got to equal Marciano's record. And then obviously Tyson knocked him out. It looked like it was all over, but like George Foreman did, he reinvented himself. So Pete, let's get to it, mate. Who wins and why?
I always like Mike going first because Mike's got that brilliant mind and I can slip through it. Now I have to go first, so I'm a bit opening up here. Look, I think early we see a barrage of George Foreman nearly taking Larry Holmes out, and Larry Holmes looking like a nightclub patron at 3 a.m, but hanging on for dear life. And maybe Larry goes down once as well. And then by the 4th and 5th round, Larry starts to get into a rhythm where he starts to jab, and Foreman's still coming on strong. By about 7 or 8, Foreman realises that Larry is not going to go down like everyone else does, and he has to pace himself and slows down a bit to go the full 15. And that's where Holmes starts to jab and move. But for mine, Foreman builds up way too many points early and kind of doesn't cruise, but wins a very, very close decision with Holmes coming over the top and winning the last 3 or 4 rounds.
Okay, so Foreman by decision, and he didn't win a lot by decision either, did he, over the years, especially those early days? All right, Mike, who you got?
Foreman won plenty by decision. The referee decided to stop the fight when he knocked the other guys out.
Good point.
So my breakdown's actually very similar to Pete's, so I'm actually glad you went first this week. I think that there's shaky moments for Holmes to absorb early. I think Holmes might even be able to bank round 1 or 2, but at some point in the fight he's going to get clipped, and I think that when he gets clipped, he goes down. The one thing that, I think he gets back up. I think he's able to work his way back into the fight. And in the 90s, I would be fully confident that any version of Foreman in the 90s, in his prime in that time, versus the prime of Holmes in the 90s, I'd back that Foreman every day of the week. I think these two guys in their prime, there's not enough intel of Foreman beyond 6-7 rounds that's positive in that first era. And I think that Holmes is able to dance and box and move. And I see him coming from behind, but just slightly different to Pete. I edge maybe 8-7, 9-6 to Larry Holmes.
Yeah, okay, so similar type of fights, but one each. I'll be the tiebreaker here. I totally agree with both of you, is actually the way the fight would go. I think Foreman would come out like he always does and do his best Clubber Lang impersonation and let him go from everywhere. But I think Holmes was such a smart fight, probably in the Ali mould in that respect. So I think he would be smart. I'm probably like you, Pete. I think he might wear a couple and maybe even go down. But I think his ring IQ and the fact that it would be a 15-rounder, I think as the fight went on, as Foreman would start to wind down, I think Larry would really start to pick it up and win most of the late rounds. I'm probably with you, Mike. I think 9 rounds to 6 that Holmes would get the decision. Having said that, who knows? Foreman could go out there and wipe him out in 2 or 3 rounds, but I don't think Holmes was that type of fighter that even though he could get nailed and could get rocked, he really had a great chin like Ali did. And I think he would have, similar to Ali, I don't think he would have taken Foreman out. If he did, it would be very late, but I think it would do enough to cruise to a decision of, as I said, like 9 rounds to 6. So I think all up, so that means what's 2-1. Pretty much a similar type of fight, but Pete, you had Foreman winning by decision, and Mike and I both had Holmes winning by decision. Tassie, for what it's worth, picked Holmes by decision as well. Pretty much exactly the way we've said. So maybe I've got to lift my game because we've pretty much had identical previews of the fight, but just one different with Pete. So just on that, Tassie's not here, so we're going to skip over Tassie, which means we go to you, Pete. Have you had a think about who you're going to have for your dream fight next week?
Yep, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield won.
No, that's a classic fight.
Oh, you want dream fights? Yeah, but we didn't do.
Just on the classic fight. Yeah, great fight too. Holyfield Tyson won. Let's go for the dream fight.
Dream fight. I've got Konstantin Tszyu up against Emmanuel Pacquiao, both at 140.
Ooh. So, all right. So Manny Pacquiao versus Costa Tszyu. Phew. Okay. What do you reckon? We won't actually talk about it now, of course, but that's a very tough one to even think of. That one. Who did we have? We had him against Oscar De La Hoya, didn't we? Costa. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Beautiful. That's a great one, Pete. And then we'll get Tassie the week after that. So, classic fight is going to be Holyfield Tyson 1. The dream fight is going to be Pacquiao versus Tszyu, which is, geez, I'm just trying to think how that fight would go. It'll be entertaining, that's for sure.
Oh, would it ever? Would it ever?
What time frame are we looking at there, Pete? What version of Pacquiao? What version of Tszyu?
I'd say Pacquiao 2009.
Okay, yeah.
And
Pete, yep.
I'd say Kostya Tszyu maybe 99.
Okay. All right.
He was about 99, 98, 99.
Yep. Well,
say late 90s.
Yep.
Kostya Tszyu up against Manny, the 2009 version at 4.
Hopefully that's a bit of inspiration for Mike for next time. I think just we'll get past the Jeff and Barry McGuigan saga and we'll just move on, never to be spoken of again. All good, guys. Well, so if you're watching this, obviously get on the Instagram and vote on who you think will win, and we'll post the results next week. But that was Larry Holmes versus George Foreman. 3 out of 4 went for Larry Holmes by decision. So thanks for watching. Thank you two guys for being part of it. We'll have Tassie back next week and look forward to going over Tszyu versus Pacquiao. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.